In the heart of London, where ancient traditions meet modern life, something extraordinary happened that would challenge everything we think we know about duty, compassion, and the power of human connection. A moment so powerful that it would make a trained soldier abandon his post, drop his weapon, and risk everything for a stranger. This is not a fairy tale or a movie script. This is the true story of how a single gesture from a small boy broke through centuries of military protocol and revealed the beating heart beneath a ceremonial uniform. What you're about to read will make you question the boundaries we create, the walls we build, and the masks we wear. It's a story that proves sometimes the most profound acts of courage come not from following orders, but from following our humanity. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is to remember that beneath the uniform, beneath the training, beneath the duty, there beats the heart of a person who still remembers what it means to care for someone smaller, younger, and more vulnerable than themselves. This is the story of a moment when protocol met compassion, when duty faced love, and when a child's desperate signal cut through all the noise of the world to reach the one person who could help. Get ready for a journey that will restore your faith in the goodness that exists in the most unexpected places and the most unlikely heroes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. The heavy wool fabric, adorned with golden buttons and intricate braiding, felt familiar against his shoulders after 12 years of service with the Queen's Guard. His black bearskin cap sat perfectly atop his head, the ceremonial plume standing at attention just as he was trained to do. Today, like every other day for the past 3 months, he would stand motionless for 2 hours outside Buckingham Palace, a living statue representing centuries of British military tradition. James had always taken pride in his role. Unlike many of his fellow guards who saw the ceremonial duty as a break from real military service, he understood the deeper meaning. Every tourist who stopped to take a photograph, every child who waved excitedly, every elderly veteran who nodded with respect, they weren't just looking at James Mitchell from Manchester. They were witnessing a connection to history, a link to the countless brave men and women who had stood in these same positions, protecting the same ideals, maintaining the same unwavering dedication to duty. The transition from active military service to ceremonial guard duty hadn't been easy for James. Just 18 months earlier, he had been serving in Afghanistan, where every moment required split-second decisions and constant vigilance. The desert heat, the weight of real ammunition, the knowledge that lives depended on his actions. It was a world away from the controlled environment of central London. When shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had damaged his left leg, ending his deployment early, James had feared his military career was over. The doctors had been optimistic about his recovery, but the psychological adjustment proved more challenging than the physical healing. Standing guard outside Buckingham Palace had become his therapy. The rigid discipline required to remain motionless for hours at a time helped him focus his mind. The countless faces that passed by reminded him that his service still had meaning, even if it looked different now. Children would giggle and try to make him smile, teenagers would pose for selfies beside him, and occasionally an older person would simply nod with understanding, recognizing the sacrifice that the uniform represented. But this particular Tuesday morning felt different somehow. James couldn't quite put his finger on what had changed, but there was an energy in the air that seemed unusual. Perhaps it was the way the autumn light filtered through the trees, or the excited chatter of an unusually large group of school children who had arrived early for their tour. Whatever it was, James felt more alert than usual as he took his position at the palace gates. The morning tourists began to arrive in their typical waves. First came the early photographers, eager to capture the guards in the soft morning light before the crowds descended. James had learned to recognize the different types of visitors over his months of service. There were the serious photographers with expensive equipment who understood the artistry of their work. There were the casual tourists who wanted quick snapshots to prove they had been there. There were the history buffs who would spend long minutes studying every detail of the uniforms and ceremony. And there were the children, always the children, whose pure fascination and innocent joy reminded him why traditions like this mattered. Around 9:30, a school group approached. James could hear their teacher explaining the significance of the Queen's Guard, her voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had given the same tour dozens of times before. The children, probably around 8 or 9 years old, clustered around her in their matching blue uniforms, their faces upturned with curiosity and excitement. James had seen hundreds of such groups during his time on duty, but something about this particular class caught his attention. Most of the children were engaged and excited, asking questions and pointing at various aspects of the ceremony and architecture. But one boy stood slightly apart from the group. He was smaller than the others, with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed older than his years. While his classmates chattered and laughed, this boy watched James with an intensity that was both touching and slightly concerning. There was something in the child's expression, a depth of focus that seemed unusual for someone so young. James had been trained never to acknowledge individual members of the public during his ceremonial duties. The Queen's Guard were expected to remain as still as statues, their eyes fixed straight ahead, their faces expressionless. Breaking this protocol was grounds for serious disciplinary action. These weren't just arbitrary rules. They were traditions built over centuries, designed to maintain the dignity and solemnity of the ceremonial role. Every guard understood that their individual identity was supposed to disappear behind the uniform and the duty it represented. Yet, as the morning progressed, James found his attention repeatedly drawn back to the quiet boy. Even after the school group had moved on to other parts of their tour, the child's image remained in his mind. There had been something in those young eyes, not just curiosity, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. It was the look James had seen in the eyes of fellow soldiers, the unspoken communication that passed between people who understood what it meant to stand at attention, to maintain discipline, to carry responsibility larger than themselves. The morning continued with its usual rhythm. Tour groups came and went, photographers captured their images, and James maintained his position with the practiced ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was building, that the encounter with the quiet boy was somehow connected to events yet to unfold. Around 11 o'clock, the atmosphere around the palace began to shift. There was an increase in radio chatter among the police officers stationed nearby, and James noticed additional security personnel taking positions around the perimeter. As a trained soldier, he had learned to read these subtle signs of heightened alertness. Something was happening, though he couldn't determine what from his fixed position. The crowds continued to flow past his post, but James began to notice changes in their behavior as well. People were checking their phones more frequently, and there seemed to be an undercurrent of nervous energy that hadn't been present earlier in the morning. A group of tourists hurried past, speaking in rapid French about something they had heard on the news. A businessman stopped to take a phone call just within James's earshot, his voice tense as he discussed what sounded like emergency procedures at his office. Despite his curiosity about the developing situation, James maintained his discipline. Whatever was happening in the wider world, his responsibility remained the same: to stand guard, to maintain the dignity of his position, and to represent the stability and continuity that the Queen's Guard symbolized. In times of uncertainty or crisis, that symbolic role became even more important. People needed to see that some things remained constant, that some traditions endured regardless of whatever chaos might be unfolding around them. It was then that he saw the boy again. The school group had returned from their tour of the palace gardens, and once again, the dark-haired child stood slightly apart from his classmates. But this time, something was definitely different. The boy's face was pale, and his eyes darted anxiously between James and something behind him that the guard couldn't see without breaking protocol by turning his head. James felt his military training engage as his senses sharpened. Years of service had taught him to recognize when a situation was developing, even when he couldn't immediately identify the specific threat. The boy's behavior was setting off every protective instinct he had developed during his years as a soldier. There was fear in the child's posture now, a tension that hadn't been there during the morning's earlier encounter. The child took a step closer to James's position, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. James could see the boy's lips moving as if he were trying to work up the courage to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The internal struggle was visible on the young face. The child clearly wanted to communicate something important, but he was fighting against his own fear and uncertainty about approaching a guard who appeared as immovable and unapproachable as a statue. James's mind raced through his options. Protocol demanded that he remain motionless and unresponsive, no matter what was happening around him. His superiors had been clear about this expectation, and breaking it would result in serious consequences for his career. But his instincts as a protector, honed through years of military service, were telling him that this child needed help. The conflict between his duty as a ceremonial guard and his deeper obligation as a human being created a tension that grew stronger with each passing moment. The boy glanced over his shoulder again, and this time James caught a glimpse of what had captured the child's attention. Through his peripheral vision, he could see a man in a dark coat standing near the edge of the crowd. The man's behavior struck James as odd. He seemed to be watching the school group with unusual intensity, and he had positioned himself in a way that would allow him to follow them without being easily noticed by their teacher or other adults. Every alarm bell in James's trained mind began ringing at once. His experience in conflict zones had taught him to recognize potential threats, and everything about this situation felt wrong. The boy's fear, the strange man's behavior, the way the child kept trying to get James's attention, it all added up to a scenario that demanded action, regardless of protocol. The tension in the air grew thicker as James watched the scene unfold through his peripheral vision. The boy had moved closer now, close enough that James could hear his shallow, nervous breathing. The child's teacher was busy explaining something about the palace architecture to the rest of the group, completely unaware of the drama developing just a few feet away. The other children were absorbed in their own conversations and observations, their innocent chatter creating a stark contrast to the silent crisis that James sensed was building. The man in the dark coat had also moved, positioning himself behind a tour group of adults while keeping his eyes fixed on the school children. James's military training had taught him to analyze threats systematically, and everything about this individual's behavior raised red flags. His posture was too alert for a casual tourist, his clothing too formal for someone simply enjoying a day of sightseeing. Most concerning was the way he seemed to be specifically tracking the movements of the children rather than showing interest in the palace or the guards themselves. James found himself in an impossible situation. His years of ceremonial guard training had conditioned him to ignore distractions, to remain focused on his duty regardless of what was happening around him. He had stood motionless through thunderstorms, endured the taunts of drunk tourists, and maintained his composure when protesters had gathered nearby. The ability to shut out external stimuli and focus entirely on the ceremonial role was considered one of the most important skills a Queen's Guard could develop. But this was different. This wasn't about maintaining dignity in the face of minor disruptions or weather challenges. A child was clearly in distress, and James's instincts told him that ignoring the situation could have serious consequences. The boy's repeated glances between James and the suspicious man suggested that the child had identified both a threat and a potential protector, but lacked the confidence or ability to communicate the danger effectively to the adults around him. The boy took another step forward, now standing directly in front of James's position. The child looked up at the tall guard, his young face a mixture of hope and desperation. James could see tears beginning to form in the boy's eyes, and the sight cut through his professional discipline like a knife. Here was a child who needed help, who had somehow recognized that beneath the ceremonial uniform stood someone who might protect him. For a moment, James allowed his gaze to shift slightly downward, making brief eye contact with the boy. It was a minimal movement, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't looking directly at his face, but It was enough to communicate to the child that he had been seen and acknowledged. The boy's eyes widened slightly, and James could see a flicker of relief cross his features. The child glanced once more over his shoulder at the man in the dark coat, then looked back up at James with an expression of desperate hope. Slowly, carefully, the boy began to lift his right hand. James watched as the small fingers formed a shape that he recognized immediately. The child was attempting to communicate in sign language. James had learned basic sign language during his military service, as it was sometimes necessary for silent communication in combat situations. The boy's movements were hesitant and clearly unpracticed, but the message was unmistakable. "Help me." The simple gesture hit James like a physical blow. Here was a child brave enough to reach out to a stranger for protection, smart enough to attempt a form of communication that wouldn't attract unwanted attention, and desperate enough to risk approaching someone who appeared as forbidding and unapproachable as a ceremonial guard. The boy had somehow understood that beneath the rigid exterior might stand someone who would care about his safety. James felt his training as a soldier and his instincts as a protector warring against his obligations as a ceremonial guard. Every fiber of his being told him to respond to the child's plea for help, to break protocol if necessary to ensure the boy's safety. But his career, his future, and his commitment to the traditions he represented all demanded that he remain motionless and unresponsive. The boy's sign language attempt had been noticed by the man in the dark coat. James watched as the suspicious individual's attention focused more intently on the child, his body language shifting from casual observation to active interest. The man began to move closer, weaving through the crowds with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to approach a target without drawing attention. James's mind raced through possible responses. He could try to signal other security personnel, but doing so would require obvious movements that would clearly violate his ceremonial obligations. He could attempt to communicate with the child, but any response would be immediately visible to everyone in the area, including the potential threat. The very public nature of his position, which normally provided safety through visibility, now worked against him. The boy seemed to sense the approaching danger as well. His small body tensed, and he pressed closer to James's position, as if seeking protection in the guard's shadow. The child's trust in James was both touching and terrifying. Here was someone who believed that the uniform represented safety and protection, not just ceremony and tradition. James made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. Moving with the controlled precision that his military training had ingrained in him, he shifted his weight almost imperceptibly to his left. To most observers, it would appear to be nothing more than a minor adjustment in his stance, the kind of small movement that even the most disciplined guard might make during a long period of standing. But to the boy looking up at him, and to James himself, it was a clear signal. "I see you, I understand, and I'm here." The child's relief was immediate and visible. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and some of the fear left his eyes. The boy understood that his message had been received, that he was no longer alone in facing whatever threat he had identified. It was a moment of connection that transcended the barriers of age, rank, and protocol, a purely human response to a cry for help. But the situation was far from resolved. The man in the dark coat had moved closer still, and James could now see him more clearly through his peripheral vision. The individual appeared to be in his 40s, with sharp features and calculating eyes that continued to track the boy's movements. His clothing, while not unusual for a tourist, had a quality and style that suggested wealth and planning rather than casual sightseeing. James began to notice other details that increased his concern. The man carried no camera, guidebook, or other typical tourist accessories. His attention remained focused solely on the children rather than the palace, guards, or historical sites around them. Most troubling, he seemed to be timing his movements to coincide with the school group's activities, following at a distance that would allow him to track them without being noticed by their teacher or other supervising adults. The boy had apparently noticed these same concerning behaviors. The child's earlier attempts to get James's attention now made perfect sense. He had identified a potential threat and had wisely sought help from someone who appeared capable of providing protection. The fact that the boy had chosen to approach a Queen's Guard, rather than a police officer or other adult, suggested either remarkable insight about who might be most willing and able to help, or perhaps previous negative experiences with other authority figures. James's protective instincts, honed through years of military service and strengthened by his own experiences of being vulnerable and in need of help, demanded action. But the form that action should take remained unclear. Any obvious response would not only violate his ceremonial obligations, but might also escalate the situation in ways that could put the child at greater risk. The boy seemed to understand the complexity of the situation as well. Rather than continuing to try to get James's attention, the child began to position himself more deliberately near the guard's post, using James's presence as a shield between himself and the approaching threat. It was a smart tactical move that demonstrated remarkable awareness for someone so young. James felt a surge of admiration for the boy's courage and intelligence. Despite his obvious fear, the child was thinking strategically about how to use the resources available to him. The boy had correctly identified James as a potential protector, had found a way to communicate his need for help, and was now positioning himself to take advantage of whatever protection the guard might be able to provide. The school group's teacher finally began to notice that one of her students had separated from the main group. James watched as she looked around with the mild concern of someone who had temporarily misplaced a child but wasn't yet alarmed. Her eyes found the boy standing near James's position, and she began to walk in their direction, her pace casual but purposeful. The approach of an adult authority figure changed the dynamics of the situation significantly. James felt a moment of relief that the child would soon be back with his group and under the protection of a responsible adult. But his relief was tempered by the knowledge that the teacher remained unaware of the potential threat, and that the boy's return to the group might actually make him more vulnerable if the suspicious man chose to follow the school children to their next destination. The man in the dark coat had also noticed the teacher's movement toward the boy. James watched as the individual quickly stepped back into the crowd, using other tourists as cover while maintaining his line of sight to the children. The movement confirmed James's worst suspicions. This was someone who understood the importance of avoiding detection by adults while maintaining access to his targets. As the teacher approached, the boy looked up at James one final time. The expression on the child's face was a mixture of gratitude, hope, and lingering fear. In that moment, James understood that whatever happened next, this encounter had created a connection that went beyond the simple interaction between a ceremonial guard and a young tourist. Two people had recognized each other's humanity across the barriers of age, duty, and circumstance, and that recognition had created an obligation that James could not ignore. The teacher approached with the kind of gentle authority that experienced educators develop over years of managing groups of children. Mrs. Sarah Collins had been leading school trips to historical sites for over 15 years, and she prided herself on keeping track of her students while allowing them enough freedom to explore and learn. She had noticed young Tommy Henderson's tendency to wander and observe things more intensely than his classmates, but she had never seen him look quite as serious as he did standing beside the imposing Queen's Guard. "Tommy, dear, you need to stay with the group," Mrs. Collins said softly as she reached the boy's position. "We're about to move on to see the changing of the guard ceremony." She placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder, but James noticed that Tommy seemed to resist her guidance, his small body tensing as he glanced once more at the man in the dark coat. James found himself in an agonizing position. He had clearly identified a potential threat to a child, had received what he believed to be a legitimate plea for help, and was now watching as an unknowing adult prepare to lead that child away from the only protection he might have. The ceremonial guard's training demanded that he remain silent and motionless, but every instinct he had developed as a soldier and as a human being screamed for action. The man in the dark coat had moved again, positioning himself near the path that the school group would likely take toward the changing of the guard ceremony. James could see the calculation in the man's movements. He was planning something, and the crowd and ceremony would provide the perfect cover for whatever he intended to do. The guard realized with growing horror that his inaction might be enabling a tragedy that could have been prevented. Tommy looked up at James one more time, his young eyes filled with a desperate appeal. The boy seemed to understand that this might be his last chance to communicate the danger he had perceived. With movements so subtle that only James could see them, Tommy pointed with his index finger toward the man in the dark coat, then made a small gesture across his throat, a universal sign of danger that no adult had taught him, but that he understood instinctively. The gesture was James's breaking point. In that moment, years of military training crystallized into a single, clear understanding. His primary duty was not to a ceremony or a tradition or even to his career, but to the protection of innocent life. The uniform he wore represented the values of service and sacrifice, and those values demanded that he act when a child's safety was at stake. James made a decision that would end his career as a ceremonial guard, but would define him as a human being for the rest of his life. Moving with the controlled precision of his military training, he stepped forward and knelt down in front of Tommy, bringing himself to the child's eye level. The movement was a clear and unmistakable violation of ceremonial protocol, visible to everyone in the area and impossible to dismiss as a minor adjustment. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Collins stepped back in surprise, her mouth opening in astonishment at seeing the famously stoic guard break character. Other tourists began to notice the unusual scene, with some reaching for their cameras while others simply stared in confusion. The man in the dark coat also turned his attention to the developing situation, his predatory focus shifting to concern about the attention being drawn to the area. James looked directly into Tommy's eyes, his voice low but clear enough for the teacher and nearby adults to hear. "Son, I need you to tell Mrs. Collins about the man who's been following your group," he said, his words carrying the authority of someone who had spent years making life and death decisions. "The one in the dark coat, standing by the fountain. Tell her exactly what you've noticed about him." Mrs. Collins's confusion deepened, but years of teaching had taught her to trust children's instincts about adults who made them uncomfortable. She knelt down beside James, her own voice taking on a more serious tone. "Tommy, what has this man done that worried you?" The boy's words came out in a rush, as if a dam had finally burst. "He's been following us since we got here, Mrs. Collins. He doesn't have a camera or anything, but he keeps watching us, especially during the times when you're talking and not looking at us. He moved every time we moved, and when I tried to stay close to the guard, he looked angry and started walking toward us." James felt a cold fury building in his chest as he listened to Tommy's account. The boy had been displaying remarkable situational awareness for someone his age, recognizing predatory behavior that many adults would have missed. The child's instinct to seek protection from a guard had been absolutely correct. He had identified both a threat and a potential solution with impressive accuracy. Mrs. Collins's face went pale as she began to understand the implications of what Tommy was describing. She looked around quickly, trying to locate the man the boy had identified, but the individual had already begun to move away from the area, clearly recognizing that his surveillance had been detected and reported. James stood up, his ceremonial rifle still in his hands, but his attention now entirely focused on the developing situation. "Ma'am, I need you to gather your group and move them to the police station immediately," he told Mrs. Collins with the same tone he had once used to give orders in combat zones. "Don't let any of the children separate from the group, and ask one of the uniformed police officers to escort you." The teacher didn't hesitate. Years of training in child protection had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario, and she recognized the authority in James's voice even though she didn't understand why a ceremonial guard was taking charge of the situation. "Children, everyone come here right now," she called to her group, her voice carrying a new urgency that immediately captured their attention. James turned his attention back to Tommy, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did exactly the right thing," he told the child. trusting your instincts and asking for help when something felt wrong. That's what kept you and your friends safe. The boy's relief was visible, but James could see that he was still shaken by the experience. Will the man try to hurt someone else? Tommy asked, his young voice carrying a maturity that no 8-year-old should have to possess. Not if I have anything to say about it, James replied, and he meant every word. Even as he spoke, he was calculating his next moves. He had already violated every protocol of ceremonial guard duty, and his career in that role was effectively over. But he had also potentially prevented a serious crime, and he had the training and authority to ensure that the threat was properly addressed. James looked around and spotted Sergeant Davies, one of the senior police officers assigned to Palace Security. He raised his hand to signal for attention, knowing that his unusual behavior would immediately draw the officer's focus. "Sergeant Davies," he called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard with military precision. The police sergeant approached quickly, his experience reading the body language of the guards allowing him to recognize that this was not a routine interaction. "What's the situation, Guard Mitchell?" Davies asked, using James's military title to acknowledge the seriousness of the moment. "Potential child predator, sir," James replied, his training automatically switching him into the concise reporting style of military briefing. "Adult male, dark coat, approximately 40 years old, has been conducting surveillance on a school group for the past hour." The behavior was identified and reported by one of the children, who demonstrated remarkable situational awareness. Sergeant Davies' expression immediately shifted to full alertness. "Current location of the suspect? Last seen moving toward the Wellington Arch area, sir." He retreated when he realized his surveillance had been detected. "The school group is being escorted to safety, but I recommend immediate investigation and possible pursuit." The police sergeant spoke quickly into his radio, relaying James's report to other security personnel and requesting additional units to search the area. Within minutes, the response had expanded beyond the immediate palace security to include metropolitan police officers and plainclothes detectives who specialized in this type of investigation. James remained with Tommy and Mrs. Collins until additional officers arrived to take detailed statements and ensure the children's safety. Throughout this time, he was acutely aware that his breach of ceremonial protocol was being witnessed by dozens of tourists and would almost certainly result in disciplinary action. But every time he looked at Tommy's face, still pale but no longer filled with fear, he knew that he had made the right choice. The boy stayed close to James throughout the questioning process, clearly having formed a strong attachment to the guard who had listened to him and taken action to protect him. When the time came for the school group to leave, Tommy looked up at James with the kind of pure gratitude that can only come from a child who knows they have been truly seen and protected. "Thank you for believing me," Tommy said simply, and James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you for being brave enough to ask for help," James replied, and he knew that this moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the school group was escorted away under police protection, James turned to face the consequences of his actions. Captain Harrison, his commanding officer, was walking across the courtyard with the purposeful stride of someone who had just been informed of a significant breach of protocol. James stood at attention, his ceremonial rifle properly positioned, and waited to accept responsibility for his decision. But even as he prepared for the end of his career as a Queen's Guard, James felt a profound sense of peace. He had chosen humanity over protocol, protection over procedure, and the welfare of a child over his own professional interests. In doing so, he had honored the deepest values that his uniform was meant to represent, even if he had violated the specific rules that governed his ceremonial role. Captain Harrison approached with the controlled demeanor of a career military officer who had seen enough unexpected situations to know that first impressions rarely told the complete story. His weathered face showed no emotion as he stopped in front of James, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who understood that serious breaches of protocol usually had serious underlying causes. "Guard Mitchell," Captain Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years of military service. I've just received reports of a significant deviation from ceremonial protocols. Before we proceed with any disciplinary measures, I need to understand exactly what transpired here. James maintained his position at attention, his eyes fixed straight ahead as military protocol demanded. Sir, at approximately 11:45 hours, I identified what appeared to be a potential threat to civilian children visiting the palace. A young boy from a school group attempted to communicate his concerns about an adult male who had been conducting surveillance on their group. Based on my assessment of the situation and the credibility of the child's report, I made the decision to break ceremonial protocol in order to ensure the safety of the minors involved. Captain Harrison listened without interruption, his expression remaining neutral, but his attention clearly focused on every detail of James's account. Behind him, several other officers had gathered, including Sergeant Davies, who carried a radio that continued to crackle with updates from the ongoing search for the suspicious individual. Sergeant Davies, Captain Harrison addressed the police officer without taking his eyes off James. What's your assessment of Guard Mitchell's actions and their consequences? The police sergeant stepped forward, consulting his notepad before speaking. Sir, based on our preliminary investigation, Guard Mitchell's intervention appears to have disrupted what could have been a serious criminal act. The child's account has been corroborated by security camera footage showing the suspect's behavior patterns, and our specialists confirmed that the individual's actions were consistent with predatory surveillance tactics. Captain Harrison nodded slowly, processing this information. And the current status of the investigation? We've obtained clear images of the suspect from multiple camera angles and have circulated them to all relevant law enforcement agencies. Unfortunately, he managed to leave the area before we could apprehend him, but we're confident that we have sufficient evidence to pursue charges if we can locate him. The school children are all safe and have been returned to their families with appropriate counseling resources. James felt a wave of relief wash over him at the confirmation that Tommy and his classmates were safe. Whatever consequences he faced for his breach of protocol, knowing that the children were out of danger made those consequences bearable. Captain Harrison finally looked directly at James, his stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. Guard Mitchell, your actions today represented a clear violation of ceremonial protocols that have been maintained for centuries. The Queen's Guard are expected to maintain their positions regardless of external circumstances, and your decision to abandon that duty was unprecedented. James braced himself for the disciplinary measures that would surely follow. Dismissal from the ceremonial guard, demotion in rank, possibly even court-martial proceedings. All were possible consequences for his actions. But Captain Harrison wasn't finished speaking. However, the captain continued, your actions also demonstrated the core values that our military service is meant to represent. You identified a legitimate threat, took appropriate action to protect innocent civilians, and showed precisely the kind of judgment and moral courage that we hope to develop in all our personnel. The gathered officers exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the captain's tone. James remained at attention, but he could feel his pulse beginning to race as he tried to understand where this conversation was heading. The question we face, Captain Harrison said, is how to address a situation where following proper procedure would have been morally wrong, and where doing the right thing required violating established protocols. This is not a scenario covered in our standard disciplinary guidelines. Sergeant Davies stepped forward again. Sir, if I may, there's additional context that might be relevant to your decision. We've discovered that the suspect Guard Mitchell helped identify is wanted in connection with similar incidents in 3 other European cities. His pattern of behavior suggests that he specifically targets tourist locations where large groups of children are likely to be present. Guard Mitchell's intervention may have prevented not just an incident here, but potentially saved other children in other cities from becoming victims. Captain Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly at this information. You're saying that Guard Mitchell's actions had implications beyond just this immediate incident? Yes, sir. The photographs we obtained today have already been matched to security camera footage from incidents in Paris Amsterdam, and Edinburgh. International law enforcement agencies have been pursuing this individual for over 6 months, and this is the first time they've had clear images and witness testimony that might lead to his capture. James felt the weight of this revelation settling over him. His decision to help Tommy had apparently interrupted a pattern of criminal behavior that extended far beyond what any of them had realized at the time. The boy's instinctive fear of the stranger had been even more justified than anyone could have known. Captain Harrison was quiet for several long moments, clearly weighing the complex factors involved in this unprecedented situation. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying a tone of measured authority. "Guard Mitchell, your actions today place you in direct violation of ceremonial protocols, and there will be consequences for that. You will be removed from ceremonial guard duties, effective immediately." James felt his heart sink at these words, but the captain wasn't finished. "However, your demonstration of sound tactical judgment, moral courage, and protection of civilian welfare indicates that your talents might be better suited to active security roles rather than ceremonial positions." The captain paused, allowing his words to sink in. "I'm recommending you for transfer to the Royal Protection Unit, where your ability to identify and respond to genuine threats will be an asset rather than a liability. The unit has been looking for personnel with your combination of ceremonial training and practical field experience." James felt his world shift as he processed this unexpected turn of events. Rather than ending his military career, his decision to help Tommy had opened up new possibilities that he had never even considered. The Royal Protection Unit was one of the most prestigious assignments in the British military, responsible for the direct security of the royal family and other high-profile individuals. Furthermore, Captain Harrison continued, "Your actions today will be documented as an exemplary demonstration of the core values of military service. While you violated specific protocols, you upheld the fundamental principles that those protocols are designed to serve." Sergeant Davies approached James with a smile. "Guard Mitchell, I wanted you to know that the boy you helped, Tommy Henderson, asked me to give you this." He handed James a small piece of paper with careful child's handwriting that read, "Thank you for listening to me. You are a real hero. From Tommy." James felt his eyes moisten as he read the simple note. In all his years of military service, through commendations and promotions and recognition from superior officers, nothing had ever meant as much to him as those few words from a grateful child. 3 weeks later, James found himself in a new uniform, standing in a new position, with new responsibilities that utilized all of his training and experience in ways that the ceremonial role never had. The Royal Protection Unit had welcomed him enthusiastically, recognizing that his combination of discipline, judgment, and genuine care for the people he was protecting made him an ideal fit for their mission. Tommy Henderson and his family had visited James at his new posting, bringing homemade cookies and a photo that Tommy had drawn of a guard helping a little boy. The picture now sat on James's desk as a daily reminder of why his service mattered and what it truly meant to protect and serve. The investigation into the suspicious man had eventually led to his arrest at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, where international law enforcement officers have been waiting based on the intelligence gathered from the Buckingham Palace incident. The arrest had prevented what investigators believed would have been additional crimes against children, and the case had become a model for how quick thinking and interagency cooperation could protect vulnerable populations. Mrs. Collins had written to James's commanding officers, describing how Tommy's confidence had grown enormously after the incident. The boy who had once been quiet and withdrawn had become more assertive about speaking up when something seemed wrong, and he had started talking about wanting to become a police officer or soldier when he grew up so that he could help protect other children the way Guard Mitchell had protected him. Captain Harrison had visited James in his new role, bringing news that the incident had prompted a review of ceremonial guard protocols. While the basic requirements for maintaining position and dignity would remain unchanged, new guidelines had been developed for situations where guards observe potential threats to public safety. Future guards would receive enhanced training in threat assessment and would have clear procedures for alerting security personnel without abandoning their ceremonial duties. Your actions that day didn't just save those children, Captain Harrison told James during their meeting. They've helped us create better systems to protect future visitors to the palace while maintaining the traditions that make the ceremonial guard meaningful. James reflected often on the chain of events that had begun with Tommy's desperate signal for help. A child's courage in reaching out to a stranger, a soldier's decision to prioritize protection over protocol, and the ripple effects of that choice had created positive changes that extended far beyond any of them had imagined possible. The lesson that James carried forward from that transformative day was simple but profound. Sometimes the most important duty we have is not to the rules we're supposed to follow, but to the people we're called to protect. The uniform, the ceremony, the tradition, all of these were meaningful only insofar as they serve the deeper values of service, protection, and care for others. Years later, when James had his own children, he would tell them the story of the brave little boy who wasn't afraid to ask for help, and the lesson that sometimes doing the right thing requires the courage to break the rules that prevent us from protecting those who need our help most. It was a lesson about listening to our conscience, trusting our instincts, and remembering that behind every uniform, every role, and every set of responsibilities, there beats the heart of a human being called to serve something greater than themselves. The story of Guard Mitchell and Tommy Henderson became a quiet legend within military and law enforcement circles, passed down as an example of how training, instinct, and moral courage could combine to create moments of genuine heroism in the most unexpected circumstances. It served as a reminder that sometimes the greatest service we can perform is simply being willing to see someone in need and having the courage to respond, regardless of the personal cost. And in a small frame on James Mitchell's desk, a child's drawing continued to remind him every day that the most important battles are often fought not on distant battlefields, but in the moment when someone vulnerable reaches out for help and we have the choice to respond or to look away.